Hey there, and welcome back to Mama, Drama, and Trauma. I'm your host, Jenny Kimmel. If you've been following along, you know the past few months have been filled with heartbreak, healing, and hard truths. January was heavy, a month of emotional hangovers, grief, and questions that didn't have answers. But February brought something different. It brought clarity. This month wasn't easy. There were still tears, tension, and moments that made my blood boil. But for the first time in a long time, I could see things clearly. I was starting to see him for who he really was. And I was starting to see me again. This is Finding Me Again, February 2024, the month of clarity. When I look back on February, I don't think of it as a month of anger or even sadness anymore. It was the month I finally started to understand. Clarity doesn't always come with peace. Sometimes it comes with exhaustion. After you've cried every tear and fought every battle you didn't need to fight. That was me in February. The month started rough. It was Super Bowl weekend. It was my husband's weekend with the kids, and I had plans to go to my brother and sister-in-law's to watch the game. The kids were supposed to be with their dad, but they hadn't met his girlfriend yet, and that became a problem. Instead of spending the evening with the kids, he chose to spend it with her. That one hit me hard. I never imagined him putting anyone before our kids. That wasn't who he used to be. He told the kids they could stay and watch the game with him and his girlfriend, but they had never met her. And he had told me more than once that he'd talk with me before that happened. That conversation never happened. Everything he'd promised back in October, being respectful, staying on the same page for the kids, none of that was being followed through. He was doing whatever he wanted, and I guess looking back, that was his right. He was free to live his new life however he wanted, but in the middle of raising 3 kids who were still trying to process everything, I thought we could at least try to be on the same page. That weekend was just one more reminder that we weren't. My kids didn't feel comfortable staying there with him and his girlfriend, so they came home. And when they came home, I decided to head back home too. So instead of going to my brother and sister-in-law's like I'd planned, the 4 of us, just me and the boys, ended up watching the Super Bowl together at home. It was quiet and it was sad. I knew they would have preferred to be watching the game with their dad. And in a sense, they felt like he had chosen her over them. We sat there, just the 4 of us, making the best of it, like we always do. He did drop food off that night, food that he and his girlfriend had made, and that was nice. But even then, it still felt like his kids weren't at the top of his priority list anymore. They felt that, I felt that, and it was hard to accept because that's not the man I had known. He was changing, and I was changing too. And even though I can see that now, even though I know growth happens on both sides, my heart broke for my kids in those kinds of moments. Then there was the hotel. That one still sticks with me. It was one of the weekends he had the kids, and both he and his girlfriend had COVID. Wherever she was staying at the time, she couldn't stay there with COVID. So he asked the kids if she could stay at his house with them, if they'd be okay with it. And to his credit, I respect that he asked them. But they weren't comfortable. They had never met her. They just weren't ready for that yet. And honestly, I completely understood. They had already been through so much. So instead of her staying at his house, he ended up getting her a hotel room. And my money, our money, paid for it. That one cut deep. It wasn't even about the money. It was about the disrespect. I remember thinking, how did we get here? How did I end up in this place where the man I built a family with was using our money to make another woman comfortable while our kids were caught in the middle? He told me, what was I supposed to do? Let her sleep in her car? And no, of course I didn't think that. But what I couldn't understand was why she couldn't pay for her own hotel room. Why were we footing the bill? Why didn't she have $80 to take care of herself for one night? It just didn't make sense to me. It felt messy and wrong, and it put everyone in an uncomfortable situation. I couldn't understand how he could be okay using our money for that. And I couldn't understand how she could be okay accepting it. It was around that time that something shifted. I stopped being shocked. I stopped expecting him to do better. And that's when the clarity started. Not just him, not just the chaos, but myself. It wasn't one big moment, no big breakdown or revelation, just small realizations stacking up one after another until I couldn't ignore them anymore. Something in me was changing too. I was starting to realize that I couldn't keep fighting battles that weren't mine anymore. I had spent so many months pouring into him, trying to make sense of it all, trying to understand, trying to fix what was already broken. But February was when I realized I was done pouring into someone who didn't even care anymore. And even though it hurt, that realization was the beginning of finding me again. That's when I started learning to pour back into myself. Losing myself to find myself again. When I think about February, I think about how I started to come back to myself. It wasn't all at once. It wasn't some big, dramatic, I'm healed moment. It was gradual, quiet, almost invisible at first. I started realizing that somewhere along the way, I had lost myself. Not just in the marriage, but in the aftermath of it too. Even after everything had happened, the betrayal, the lies, the heartbreak, I was still pouring into him, still trying to make sense of his choices, still trying to help him understand the damage he'd done. And it hit me. I was still giving my energy to someone who didn't even care anymore. That's a hard truth to face. Realizing you're still fighting for someone who already gave up the fight. I remember sitting on the couch one night, the house quiet after the boys had gone to bed. I just sat there thinking, what am I doing? Why am I spending my nights crying over someone who's probably sitting next to her on the couch, acting like none of this ever happened? And that's when I knew something had to change. I couldn't keep pouring into someone who had drained every part of me. It was time to start pouring back into me. That realization didn't fix everything overnight. I still cried. I still felt broken some days, but it was different because I knew I was finally starting to move in the right direction. I continued journaling and writing down my thoughts and feelings. Some days I wrote in my journal, and some days those words made their way into text messages. I'm honestly not even sure which ones I sent and which ones I didn't. But I know that every word came from my heart, from a place of pain and protection, especially for my kids. Over several days that month, I wrote a series of journal entries, raw, unfiltered, and emotional. These words might sound harsh, and some were, but that's where I was at the time. That's what I was feeling, and while I'm not proud of every word, I'm not going to pretend it wasn't real, because healing isn't pretty, and these words are part of my truth. Here's the first journal entry that I'm pretty sure was sent as a text, too. Please stop teaching our kids that marriage is a bad thing, because it's not when it's between two people who truly love, respect, and are committed to each other. Marriage is sacred, and I don't want them thinking otherwise. You laughing about it with them isn't teaching them that. Just because you weren't good at it doesn't make it bad. By telling them you'll never get married again and making it sound like a joke, all you're doing is instilling in them that there's nothing good about marriage, and that couldn't be further from the truth. That one hurt to write because I had spent years believing in marriage, believing that if you loved hard enough, stayed loyal enough, you could get through anything. And then suddenly, that belief was shattered. Not just for me, but for my kids too. I never wanted them to see love that way. I never wanted them to grow up thinking that marriage was a lie or that commitment didn't matter. But that's what they were starting to believe because of his actions. And as their mom, I couldn't stand by and let that happen. This is the next journal entry I wrote. You're talking way too much to our kids about adult things. You don't need to be having those conversations with them. They are not your friends. I'm sorry you gave up all your friends and family for your girlfriend and now have no one to talk to. But our kids are not the people you should be venting to about adult problems. Some of the things they've told me you've said to them are jaw-dropping. I can't believe you think it's okay to talk to them about this stuff. They've already been through enough. Please stop putting them in the middle. I remember shaking as I wrote that one because it wasn't just anger. It was fear. Fear that my boys were being forced to grow up too fast. Fear that they were being made to feel responsible for things no child should have to carry. It's one thing to lose your partner. It's another thing entirely to watch your kids lose their innocence in the process. I knew I couldn't control what he did anymore, but I could make sure that in my home they were safe. Emotionally, mentally, spiritually. And that became my mission. Here's another journal entry from February that I'll share with you. It disgusts me how you try to justify your reasons for spending our money on her. You're disrespectful, and your apologies mean nothing because you never change your actions. Apologies only matter when you actually try to correct the behavior you're apologizing for. You say she's a good person, but a good person doesn't let a married man with kids pay for her stuff. She's not a good person, and good luck with her. You've really gotten yourself into a situation. Even reading that now, I can feel the fire in my chest. That was pure anger. Not because of jealousy, but because of disrespect. At that point, it wasn't even about him anymore. It was about integrity, morality, and the example he was setting for our kids. I couldn't wrap my head around how easily he excused his actions or how comfortable she was accepting it all. I think that was the moment I realized he wasn't just lost, he had chosen to be this version of himself, and I couldn't save him from that. Looking back, I'm not proud of how angry I was, but I'm proud that I got it out because holding it in would have destroyed me. Writing became my way of surviving the storm. Each word was a release. Each sentence was a reminder that I was still here, still fighting to find me. That month, I began to understand that healing doesn't mean you stop hurting. It means you start choosing yourself in the middle of the hurt. I started doing little things again. Taking care of myself, listening to books that reminded me I wasn't alone, thinking about my future and my next chapter. And somewhere in between the tears and the pages, I realized I was coming back to life. The parenting tension. If there was one thing that defined February, it was tension. Not just between me and him, but in the air around our kids too. It was like we were all trying to figure out what normal meant now. And no one really knew what that looked like anymore. By this point, I'd stopped expecting him to co-parent the way I had hoped we would. It was clear we were two very different people now with two very different priorities, and that was hard to accept because for so long I had seen him as the best dad. I never thought that part would change. But it did. And even though I tried to tell myself not to expect the old him to show up, a part of me still wanted to believe that he would. That month, the tension with the boys really started to show. They were angry, confused, hurt. Each of them processed things differently. One shut down, one lashed out, and one tried to hold it all together like the glue in our little family. It was painful to watch because I knew exactly where it was coming from. They were trying to make sense of everything that didn't make sense. They were trying to find their footing in a world that didn't feel steady anymore. There was one weekend that really stands out. He had gone out of town with his girlfriend to the same tournament he and I had gone to together every year before. That was our weekend trip. The one time of year I'd get a little break and he'd get to do something he loved. And now he was there with her. Ryan and Carson went to hang out with some friends, and somehow the night ended with the boys over at their dad's house. And he wasn't home. One of the other kids who was with them ended up stealing one of the dirt bikes from his backyard later that weekend. It turned into this whole messy situation. The bike ended up listed for sale on Facebook Marketplace after being modified. We did get it back eventually, but that's not really what mattered. What mattered was that it opened my eyes. My kids were starting to struggle in ways I couldn't ignore anymore. And the hard part was I couldn't blame them. They'd lost their sense of safety. Their family had fallen apart in front of their eyes. And now everything they did, every choice, every reaction was coming from that hurt. As a mom, that's a heavy thing to carry because I wasn't just dealing with my own pain anymore. I was carrying theirs too. That's when I started having more serious talks with them. Not about their dad coming back, but about what life looked like now, about reality, about acceptance. I'd tell them, this is our new normal. We can't control what he does, but we can control how we respond to it. And I could feel myself shifting into a new kind of strength. Not the kind that comes from fighting, but the kind that comes from surrendering. Accepting that some things are just out of your hands. That's when I realized I was starting to parent from a stronger place. I wasn't as reactive anymore. I wasn't crying every day. I wasn't letting his chaos bleed into our home. For the first time since everything had fallen apart, I felt like I could breathe again. Like I could show up for my kids in a steady, grounded way. There were still moments that broke me though, like when the boys would come home quiet, barely saying a word, and I could just feel something had happened at their dad's house. Something that confused them or hurt them, but they didn't want to talk about it. I remember thinking, how much more are they going to have to carry? How many situations are they going to be put in that they didn't deserve? It broke my heart because I saw them growing up faster than they should have had to. And the hardest part, they still loved their dad. Of course they did. And they wanted so badly to make him proud, to be close to him. But I could tell they were starting to feel that same disappointment that I felt. That feeling of never quite being chosen first. I could see it in their faces, and I could feel it in my own chest because I knew exactly what that felt like. There were nights I would just sit in bed after they'd fallen asleep and think, I'm so proud of them. Because through all of it, the confusion, the heartache, the chaos, they were still good kids. Kind, funny, respectful, loving. They still showed up for each other. And even though everything had changed, the four of us still found our way back to each other every single time. Those nights reminded me of our strength, that no matter what anyone else did, our love, this little family's love, was something no one could ever take away. By the end of February, I realized something else. I wasn't just healing for them anymore. I was healing with them. Every step I took forward, they saw it. Every time I chose calm over chaos, they felt it. And in that process, we were all rebuilding together. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but we were doing it together. Seeing him for who he is. There comes a point in every story when you stop trying to explain someone else's behavior and finally start to accept it. That point came for me in February. For months, I had been trapped in this endless cycle of disbelief, trying to make sense of things that would never make sense, telling myself there had to be a reason, a moment of truth that would somehow make it all feel less cruel, less personal. But it never came. And by February, I finally understood that closure wasn't coming from him. It had to come from me. That was the month I began to see him clearly. Not the man I loved, not the husband I fought for, but the man standing in front of me now. Someone I didn't recognize anymore. And that clarity, as painful as it was exactly what I needed. I kept writing through it all. It's how I processed everything I couldn't say out loud. By then, my journal was my release, a space where I could say exactly what I felt without worrying about sounding kind or composed. Some of what I wrote was angry. Some of it was ugly. Some of it still makes me cringe when I read it now. But it was real. It was how I survived when everything felt impossible. I'm not proud of all of the words I wrote, but I am proud that I allowed myself to feel. Because healing doesn't happen when you stay silent. It happens when you finally tell yourself the truth, even when that truth is messy and painful. Here's another one of my journal entries from February. You continue to apologize, but it means nothing because you never change your actions. Apologies only matter when you're actually trying to fix what you broke. You say she's a good person, but what kind of person accepts things that were meant for someone else? What kind of person steps into a family's life and doesn't think about the wreckage left behind? You both made choices. You both caused pain. And while you might justify it to each other, you can't justify it to me, and you can't justify it to your kids. You talk about wanting peace, but peace doesn't come from pretending you did nothing wrong. It comes from owning it, and that's something you still haven't done. Even now, those words make my heart ache because they weren't written from hatred. They were written from devastation. I was heartbroken by how easily he justified things that broke us, how comfortably he lived in this new version of himself that I couldn't even recognize. It wasn't just the betrayal itself. It was watching him twist reality to make it sound acceptable. And that's something I don't think I'll ever forget. Not because I'm holding a grudge, but because it taught me something about people. Sometimes when someone hurts you that deeply, they can't face what they've done. So they rewrite it in their own minds just to live with it. And I think that's what he did. He built a story that made it easier to look in the mirror. But that story wasn't my truth. And it wasn't our kids' truth either. That's the thing about clarity. It doesn't always feel good. It's not some beautiful, peaceful realization. It's raw. It's sharp. It burns on the way in, but it also sets you free. That month, I stopped trying to fix him. I stopped waiting for him to do the right thing. I stopped hoping for an apology that was never going to come. And instead, I turned that energy back toward myself. I realized I could forgive without forgetting. I could grieve without staying stuck. And I could finally let go of the version of him I had loved for so long, the version that no longer existed. Looking back now, I can say this with peace. I don't hate him. I don't even wish him harm. But I do wish he had handled things differently. I wish he had protected our kids better. And I wish he had valued what we had enough to not destroy it. But that's not my burden to carry anymore. It's his. February was the month I stopped carrying what wasn't mine. It was the month I stopped internalizing his choices as my fault. And it was the month I realized that the only person I could control was me. Seeing him for who he really was broke something in me, but it also set something else free. Because once you stop living in the story you wish were true, you finally make space for the one that is. And that's where the real healing begins. Reclaiming me. By the time February came to an end, I wasn't healed, not even close. But I was standing, and that in itself felt like a miracle. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't falling apart every single day. I wasn't begging for answers or replaying the same memories over and over in my head. I was just breathing. Maybe not deeply yet, but enough to start feeling like myself again. That month, I started to notice small changes, subtle shifts that probably wouldn't have looked like much from the outside. But to me, they meant everything. I started focusing on my kids again, but in a different way. Not from fear, not from panic, but from a calmer, more grounded place. I had spent months holding on so tightly, trying to protect them from every hurt, trying to fix what I couldn't fix. But I realized with the help of Dr. Denise that sometimes the best thing you can do for your kids is to let go just a little, to let them be kids, to let them laugh, make mistakes, and find their own way through the hard stuff. She reminded me that healing wasn't just mine to do, it was ours. And the only way we'd make it through was if I stopped trying to control every outcome and started trusting the process. So I started easing up. Little by little, I stopped trying to predict what my husband would do next. I stopped reacting to every text, every little thing that used to send me spiraling. Instead, I focused on what I could control. The energy in my home, the love my boys felt when they walked through the door, and the peace I was trying to create, even when life didn't feel peaceful. There were still nights I cried after they went to bed, nights when I missed the life I thought I'd have, the holidays that would never look the same, and the future I had to let go of. But there were also moments, quiet, sacred moments, where I'd catch myself laughing again. Or I'd look at my boys sitting around the dinner table, teasing each other, and think, okay, we are all going to be all right. Because we were. Maybe not whole yet, but together. And that meant more to me than anything. I started to take better care of myself again, too. Not perfectly, but with intention. Some days it looked like a walk with Maisie. Some days it looked like a long shower and a journal entry. Some days it looked like just sitting in silence, letting myself cry without guilt. And for the first time in months, those tears didn't feel like weakness. They felt like release. I wasn't crying because I was stuck anymore. I was crying because I was finally letting go. That's the thing about healing. You never realize how heavy everything was until you start to put it down. And that's what February was for me. The month I started putting it all down, the resentment, the guilt, the self-blame, the idea that I had to keep proving I was okay. I didn't have to be okay every day. I just had to keep showing up for my kids, for my healing, for me. I remember one night near the end of the month, I was sitting on the couch with Maisie curled up at my feet. The house was quiet, the boys were in their rooms, and for the first time, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt peaceful. And I remember whispering to myself, "You're going to be okay. You're going to make it through this stronger than you've ever been." And for the first time, I actually believed it. Because that's what February really was, a turning point. The month I stopped living in reaction to what had happened and started living with intention about what came next. It wasn't a straight line. It wasn't easy, but I could feel the pieces slowly coming back together. And I was proud of that because even in the messiest parts of my story, I kept showing up. And that's how I know I was finding myself again. As always, you are strong, you are worthy, and your story matters. Until next time, take care of you.